Hello, everyone. My name is Susan Farned, and I am the Executive Vice President for IS&T. I want to welcome you to our 7th and final seminar of this year's series featuring the best student research from Electronic Imaging 2020. Today's presentation is being given by Davit Gigilashvili on vivid light patterns and material translucence. I'd like to start, though, by taking a moment to thank an individual donor who wishes to remain anonymous and the Royal Photographic Society for support of this program. Their sponsorship helps us provide EI student registration grants and to ensure the continuation of online seminar series like this. I'd also like to take a couple minutes to tell you about IS&T and the Electronic Imaging Symposium in particular. For those not familiar with IS&T, the Society is unique in that it is the place where industry and academia meet, which makes the conferences it offers a great place for students to showcase work to prospective employers and for those in industry to learn about exciting developments in imaging research. IS&T spans imaging across applications from vision and capture through processing to output. Its conferences, courses, and journals offer a place to share the latest innovations with a network of others who have a love for and curiosity about the world of imaging. IS&T's breadth is best found at the Electronic Imaging Symposium, where about 20 conferences and more than 25 courses offer everything from augmented reality, virtual reality, and autonomous vehicles to big data, remote imaging, and mobile devices. Two great features about EI are the open access proceedings and the ability to submit a journal paper, which gives you a journal citation in lieu of the proceedings paper, and to still give a talk. EI 2021 will be held online, and the EI conference committee is constructing programs that offer high quality papers with many opportunities to connect, communicate, and network as you would in person. EI can be a bit overwhelming at times with its 20 conferences. But it is a great place to learn about the ways the fundamental science and technology explored in the academic setting can be incorporated into and improve our world. For students, it offers registration grants, a student or young professional research showcase, a demonstration session, which is a bit like a show and tell, conference best paper awards, and the ability to take courses for free. I encourage you to explore what EI has to offer and to submit relevant research. And today's the final submission deadline, so you still have a little bit of time to do so. Now on to the program. Our goal for these seminars is to provide a forum where we can hear about interesting research and then have a group discussion around the talk. We want everyone here to feel free to participate in the conversation. To facilitate this, please take a minute to rename yourself on Zoom to your first and last name, plus your affiliation. This will help us all to get to know each other better, like wearing a badge at a conference. We also ask that you turn your webcam on when we get to the discussion phase of the program. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Davit Gigilashvili, a third-year PhD student at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, studying perception of material appearance. His research interests include gloss and translucency perception, color vision, computer graphics, and image quality. His pre-pandemic hobbies were hiking and traveling, while cooking and baking have become his major post-pandemic hobbies. His talk today discusses the vivid patterns of light projected onto surfaces by a clear object, like a wine glass. These patterns carry interesting information about the material's translucency. Davit?
Yeah, thank you very much, Suzanne, for a very nice presentation. Am I audible?
Yes.
Great, then yeah, I will start sharing my screen. And so, do you see my screen now?
Yes.
Great, thank you very much, everybody, for joining my talk today. So today I'm going to present my work about caustics and translucency perception that was presented at Material Appearance Conference in January. And yeah, let's kick off. So the structure of my today's talk looks as follows. So I'll start with the motivations of what inspired us to do this research and what were the reasons we came up with this idea. And then I will present the experimental setup, how we explored the question, what kind of results we got, and there will be some room for discussion and conclusions. And afterwards, I would be happy to answer all your questions. Yeah, let's start. So let's start with some definitions. So what is caustics? When I was discussing this talk with Suzanne, we thought that it would be better to put up the title vivid light patterns, while caustics are not always like vivid, but still like to make it easier to understand because the term might be confusing for some. But yeah, let's start with the definitions to make sure that we're all on the same page. So there are multiple definitions of the term that can be found in the literature, like three-dimensional envelope of imperfectly focused rays that are like falling on a surface, or caustics occur if the light is reflected or refracted at one specular surface, and then it's focused, the ray bundles are focused on another surface. And caustics, and the third one is my favorite, and I believe more clearer one. Caustics are a result of convergence of light at a single point. So when the light is reflected or refracted within a surface, and then it is focused on a surface and creates these vivid, bright patterns of light. And here is a great example of that. We experience caustics as a phenomenon, physical phenomena on a daily basis. For example, a simplest example is a glass of water. And when it's put in the sunlight, you see some bright spots on the table, falling on the table. And that's exactly what I mean with caustics, when the light is refracted through the water, and then we get this kind of focused rays of light on the surface of the table. Yeah, about translucency perception, there has been some papers addressing this problem, and they usually focus on the object itself. So there are like different hypotheses and proposals how human visual system, how we humans understand that a material is translucent. So if you're given an opaque material that does not transmit any light, and then you are given another material that permits some kind of light transport within it. So you see the light is penetrating the material, and then it's exiting somewhere else from this object, and you see that, okay, this is translucent and this is opaque, but how do we exactly understand that? That's a point. So the previous works have focused on the statistics and different image cues that present on these kind of materials. Like, for example, on the left-hand side, you see the slice of kiwi, and you see like that the flesh looks different from the seeds. Seeds are solid opaque. They are more like solid color, black, while for the flesh, we see a pretty big variation in color and in luminance, I would say. Some parts are brighter and some parts are darker, and we see this gradient of luminance. So we see how the shades change from like brighter parts to darker parts. And it's easy for us to understand and to deduce that there is some light penetration happening on the top part of it. And on the right-hand side, you can also see that the parallelepiped, the cubic-like form, looks more opaque because the colors look more homogeneous on it. While here, when we have translucency, we see like brighter parts, we see some shading, like thinner parts transmit light easier, while thicker torso looks more like darker blue. And this kind of statistics and various cues have been studied a lot. But let's go on and have another look at the different materials. Like here, if I tell you like which one is opaque and which one is transparent and translucent, I believe it will be a very easy task for you to say that the left one is opaque and the middle one is translucent and the leftmost one is transparent, that transmits light without much scattering and it's possible to see through. And if we put them in a context, it becomes even more obvious. And we have been conducting a big project where we give people different tasks about material appearance and ask them to have some like tasks completed, for example, ranking objects by glossiness or translucency, and to discuss why they think so and so on. And what we observed is that translucency is usually like in addition to the object cues assessed based on the caustics. And that was a very surprising observation for us. So when we gave these three objects to people and asked them, okay, which one is most translucent and which one is opaque, they started justifying their decisions based on the caustics. They say, oh, look, here we see just gray shadow. So it's obvious that the light is not going through the material, while here and here I see these color patterns. And then they started describing the material properties based on these patterns that do not belong to the object, but they are somewhere in the scene, like in this case, falling on the table. And that gave us an idea to study this question further, how this more like understanding of the scene and presence of caustics impacts perception of translucency. And here is another example which is more challenging. So if I ask you, for example, about this object, the middle one in the bottom row, I believe most of the people would say that this looks pretty opaque. I don't see any like variation of luminance like in the this object on the left one in the same row, and it looks pretty solid, dark blue. But if we put like full context, then this bluish caustics in the shadow are the only indicators that, okay, there is some light going through this material. So this is not really opaque. Indeed, our vision might be tracked at some point, and this might be the texture of the surface. But in this case, like this is, I want to make clear that this is a photograph. It's not a computer graphics rendering. This is actually very realistic, and that makes us feel that, okay, object E is translucent, not opaque. So, and then we decided to study this question, how presence or absence of caustics impacts translucency perception, and why caustics are interesting. Another reason is that they are very costly to be rendered in computer graphics. And there has been question asked in graphics community whether we really need caustics and whether they give us like important cues for perception of realism. And there have been some works, for example, showing why caustics are important in perception of underwater scenes. And in this case, we want to know how important caustics are for perception of translucency of the material. Yeah. So then the question was, how do we remove caustics? So we want to compare scenes with caustics and without caustics and ask people like whether the material in one scene and the second one, if it's an identical material, looks equally translucent. And then the challenge was, how should we remove caustics from the scene? We have been discussing like a lot this, and we declined a lot of proposals like among us, the co-authors. Initial thought was caustics off rendering when we render in computer graphics without caustics, or rendering image and then editing in Photoshop and removing caustics that way, or it could be like rendering an opaque object and the translucent object and then cropping the translucent one and pasting into the opaque object scene. But these three are not really physically accurate, so they don't really correspond to what happens in reality. So they're against the laws of physics, and also they are not realistic when we see that translucent object and there is like solid dark gray shadow. It's not really realistic. Another thought was varying refractive index, so how the material refracts the light, but that could give us physically accurate results, but that adds another degree of freedom. So we are varying multiple parameters, and we said, okay, this is a completely different direction, how refractive index impacts caustics and translucency perception. So let's put this aside. Another idea was either floating the object in the air where we don't see the table, or putting some like additional objects that occlude the caustics. But then the problem was that the scene structure completely changes, and it might have some unintended side effects because when we place additional object, the geometry changes and we might get some other cues affected. So after a long discussion, we came up with an idea that to change the color of the floor and to put a black floor that absorbs all the light that is projected onto it. And here is an example. So we call for simplicity's sake, we call the left one the white floor scenario, where we see the caustics and on the right hand side, there are the same materials, but these caustics aren't visible anymore because the floor absorbs them all. This approach is not perfect. I will discuss this later, but we found this most straightforward way to remove the caustics, and we placed them in cornel box and decided to use physically based rendering in computer graphics to have the results as close as possible to what happens in reality. And then we use like 5 different shapes, because different shapes, different geometries of the object form different patterns of caustics. And we had a cube, an elephant, wine glass, Stanford bunny, and a sphere. And we kept one sphere, and I will discuss this shortly why. And we then varied translucency. And to make this like as a first step to make this simple, we decided to keep the volume scattering intact. So whatever happens inside the material is exactly the same among all those objects. And how we vary translucency is surface scattering. So we start from a very smooth object and we make surface rougher and rougher, and making like a rougher surface evokes perception of translucency. But whatever happens inside the materials are exactly the same. So we don't change how they absorb light inside or how do they scatter it. And yeah, here should be the 6th level of translucency that is like slightly rougher than this one, but yeah, so it more or less looks the 5th one. So experimental setup, we conducted this study online, and we asked our participants to rate the objects, to assign them to categories, like from most translucent one to least translucent category. And we had like 5 shapes, 6 different surface roughnesses, 2 different colors for floor, and that is in total 60 images. And we had 50 observers. But there was a challenge, like when we asked people what is more translucent. For gloss, for example, it's easier, right? Like we have matte, we have like mirror-like, perfectly specular object, and we can ask which is glossier, which you see is like more specular or shinier. But for translucent, this is a very confusing point. So we have like some scattering happening that makes translucent appearance, but what does more translucent mean? Is it like closer to opacity where the light isn't transmitted, or it's closer to transparency where the light is transmitted easily without scattering? And then we wanted to have a look at this as well. And to 13 people as a pilot study, we gave them like this task without further instructions or definitions. And then we had 37 people where we imposed our own definition. And in this case, we defined that least translucent means closer to opacity, while most translucent means like permitting light transport and like light transmission easily, so closer to transparency. Interestingly, the trends and the results were nearly identical between the two groups. So for the rest of the presentation, I will be talking about the aggregate results because they really gave the same pictures. And here is how the experimental, this is a screenshot from the experiment. So the test image is on the left-hand side, and both objects, a sphere and the elephant, are made from the same material, and observers should assign the category from the drop-down menu. And on the right-hand side, we have examples, references, how the most translucent or smoothest object looks, white and black floors, and how it looks on, how the roughest one looks. The reason we also thought a lot about presenting this reference. The reason why we did this is because without reference, people might start judging translucency like as making absolute judgments, and that's very confusing. And that's also has been shown in the literature that people are not really consistent. So what is the most translucent, what is least translucent? If you scale this, and different people have different understanding when they are asked to give absolute values. So in this case, we want to make this simpler and more consistent to get more consistent responses because the task was simpler. And we asked them for relative judgments. And to get the relative judgments of translucency, we just illustrated the extremes to them, and then it was up to them to place the objects between these two extremes. And here are the results. So at first we assumed that people are using the equally spaced scale. So each level, we had 6 levels they had to choose from the drop-down menu, are like equal distances in terms of translucency. And here we illustrate the results with like mean categories. So when they give a number from 1 to 6, we found the mean values for each object. And then these bars extend to like 95% confidence intervals. And the red squares correspond to the material on the white floor, and the one with the blue correspond to the materials on the black floor, and the same materials are grouped together, so they follow one another. And we have mean translucency score, mean or observer score, and we have the roughness value here, and we have different shapes. And yeah, of course, when the value is lower, it's considered closer to transparency or more translucent. And when it's higher, it's considered less translucent, so closer to opacity. And as we see, like for most of the cases, or like I would say like for all cases, the white floor one is closer to transparency, it's considered more translucent, while the black floor counterpart is closer to opacity. And even more, like we can say that like for many of those 95 confidence intervals do not overlap. So with 95% confidence, we can say that, okay, they're like different. The difference in perceived translucency is really significant. The only case where we have like lots of overlaps is the smoother objects, like here and here and here, and even like here and here. So for smoother objects, I'm sorry, the difference was not significant, and that's an interesting, I'm sorry. Yeah, the illumination went. So yeah, the reason for this, we think, is that it's a specific case, because when the object is smooth, we have clear reflections on the environment. People see the reflection image, they understand that we have also the reference, and people easily understand that this is transparent material, the surface is very smooth, and they make this match very easily because the image that is reflected on the surface is very clear. But when we make them rougher and when it gets blurrier, then it is more difficult to have this one-to-one mapping with the reference. And yeah, the next step was like, initially we assumed that people are using equally spaced scale. So the steps from level 1 to level 2 and from level 2 and level 3 are identical. But as we see on the example of the smooth ones, that's not really the case. So the difference between 1 and 2 and between 2 and 3 might not be the same. So in the next step, we applied Torjenson's law of categorical judgment. And here we judge them relative to the boundaries of the categories. So these horizontal bluish lines show the boundaries of the categories that we get from this experimental data. But and what we plot here is not the mean scores, but they are the standard z-scores. So they are relative to the population mean and shows like how far they are from, how many standard deviations away they are. But the most interesting thing here is that still we get the same trend. We get that black floor is considered less translucent and white floor is considered more translucent. But strangely, like the same material, for example, identical material, is sometimes placed in the same category and sometimes it's placed in two different categories. Like if we take a sphere here, like we see these two are placed in two different categories. So they belong to different levels of translucency, while these two, although the 95% confidence intervals do not overlap, they are put still in the same pool. And I believe the reason for this is that we assumed that when we have 6 levels of surface roughness, it should lead us to 6 different levels of translucency, but that's not really true. So looking at this data, I believe that there are more steps needed, denser sampling needed to fully quantify these differences in translucency. So long story short, I believe there are more than 6 steps of translucency or 6 levels of translucency. And that's why we have some pretty significantly different stimuli ended up in the same pool. But again, the trend is pretty similar. And finally, we wanted to have a look whether this trend looks different for different shapes. And here we have them clustered by alpha, by surface roughness. And we have like 5 different shapes, results for 5 different shapes. For a given material is fixed. In this case, even surface roughness is fixed. And we just compare different shapes. And we see that like on the same kind of floor, on the black floor, they overlap a lot. And on the white floor, they also overlap a lot with like a few exceptions only. And this means that in this case, the change of shape has not really impacted their judgments a lot, but this has explanation because we had a sphere that was always present in the scene to make it like, to make relative judgment easier. And that might have compensated for this effect, because when we have a sphere, let's maybe have a look here. When we have a sphere present in all scenes and we have a cube and elephant, people might look at the spheres and might not look at the elephant and the cube. So it's just like they tend to simplify their task, and that might have compensated for potential impact. So what we believe should be done next is to have just like one-to-one comparisons between the shapes, not like having a constant sphere that is present there. And we have some exceptions where like white floor and black floor one really stand out. And for example, for this bunny here, like we have really big difference, and even like jump, two-step jump between the categories. And the reason I believe for this is that we had a fixed order of the trials. So the images were shown always in the same order to all participants, and they were randomized, but still in some cases, 2 identical shapes ended up like being compared like one after another. And this toggling effect, so when the shape doesn't change and we move from one bunny to another, or like for example, one bunny on a black floor and another bunny on the white floor, then this toggling effect makes that the difference more dramatic. They see that there is something big changing there. While when they have to compare something like after 5 different comparisons, it's more difficult for them to recall how that stimulus exactly called. So their judgment is more independent. While here, the judgments are not really independent and they're judging based on the previous image shown. So this, I believe, needs also to be considered for the next experiment. And finally, we also had a look how this surface roughness impacts mean translucency value. And as we see, the relationship is monotonous. So when we make surface roughness, it monotonously impacts perception of translucency. So when we have smoother object, people think it's more translucent under our definition. And when we make surface rougher and rougher and rougher, then they say, okay, this is getting closer to opacity. So this correlation is pretty straightforward. And also, as I already mentioned, like for all of those cases, white floor one looks more translucent or closer to transparency than the black floor one. So when we have black floor, when we have no caustics, people think this is something more opaque for all of those. So we don't have any overlap between these curves. So for example, for elephant, we have smooth elephant made of the same, actually the identical elephant. And if it's on the white floor, it's closer to 0. And if it's black floor, it's closer to opacity. And they never, these two lines never overlap for our samples. And the correlation between surface roughness and translucency, mean translucency score was pretty high, the linear correlation coefficient. And as we already mentioned, the specificity of assessment of translucency or transparency is a bit special, like different for smooth objects because they have a whole new and different cues there. So if we take this special case, a completely smooth object out of this data, then the correlation is increased even like further up to 0.98. But I believe if we make surface even rougher, that might not be fully monotonous. And at some point people might say, okay, this doesn't make any more difference and it never becomes fully opaque. So what are the limitations of this study? With our approach, we could not remove the caustics other than those on floor. So we see some like very weak caustics on the walls as well. We do not know whether people have paid any attention to those, and we have now an idea of how this can be solved by eye tracking. But right now, we don't know whether these tiny caustics on the walls have impacted their perception. Also, as I already mentioned, the sphere present in the scene might compensate for cross-shape differences, and that was not really the perfect decision to put that there. And in the future, we will study those like shapes separately. And also the rendering limitation, no interreflections taken into account between the microfacets. So when we use a microfacet model to model the surface, we have like those like tiny facets that create the all the surface topography. But when we make objects rougher, they become darker, and that's to some extent logical because we also have shadowing and masking, and the light is not specularly reflected from the surface, like in terms of like mirror-like reflection from the whole object as here. But still, it should not be that dark in reality because these tiny facets that make up this very rough surface interreflect the light between each other, and the current rendering algorithms suffer from this limitation that it's very difficult to compensate for these interreflections. And this rendering limitation make our images not 100% realistic, but still we have done our best to make this as close as possible to the full physical accuracy. But that's another point that might have biased our results. So to conclude on this, we have strong indications that black floor leads to less apparent translucency. But another point is that we don't really know whether this is only due to removal of caustics, because there might be other cues impacted. For example, it might be the lightness. For example, the bottom sphere here looks lighter and there is more luminance here than here. No, I'm sorry. So if yeah, it's a bad example because the roughness is different. So if we have this sphere placed on the white surface, I'm sorry for the confusion. Yeah, if we have the sphere placed on the white surface, this sphere will be overall will be shinier, will be brighter, there will be more luminous because we have lots of light reflected back from the surface, while when the object is placed on the black surface, it's not only caustics, it's all the light that is reflected from the surface that is absorbed, and then the overall scene looks a bit darker and the object also looks a bit darker. So it impacts this luminance information, impacts lightness, and that might be another reason. So we remove caustics that we are certain about, but there might be some unintended side effects happening that we are not really certain about. And that's why in the future, I want still to find a better way to somehow isolate caustics without touching other stuff. And if you have any suggestions how we could remove caustics to conduct this kind of experiment, I would be very happy to discuss this with you. Also, volume scattering should be considered because different kind of subsurface light transport might have different kind of effect on this. So right now we just change surface roughness, but how the light is scattered inside the material, that has huge impact on caustics, and that should be addressed in the future. And this is like, as a first step, we took extreme case on the one end. So we had a fully absorbing black surface, but instead in the future, what we can have is like a variation of floor colors. We can start like from really like bright white one, and we can have lighter gray and darker gray, and we can end with this extreme black. And we can see how this, how the color of the surface impacts perception of translucency. Or another thing could be to change the roughness of the table, because then the sharpness of the caustics will also change. Right now we have very sharp caustics, but if we blurry this because of the roughness of the table, it might give us different impact. And I believe this is interesting way to go ahead, because it might have applications, practical applications like in marketing. So if we have an object like a bottle that is fully opaque in my case, and if we place it on a white table and on the black table, we want to know how translucent it will look, how glossy, how it will impact the appearance of the object itself. So I believe this is an interesting direction to study more, to vary the surface where we project our caustics. And another potential of this work can be contribution to image-based measurement. So people try to measure material properties based on images, and caustics might give us interesting hints about the properties of the material. So as I have shown in the beginning, this caustic, how sharp they are, how bright, what is the color of the caustics, already contain very rich information about material properties. So we saw that the orange objects project orangish caustics on the white surface and so on, and the rough ones project blurrier caustics and so on. And then there was raised a question about whether there are caustic metamers, whether two completely different objects or materials can produce same kind of caustics, whether that's possible or not. I don't have an answer on this, but it's a fascinating question just to think about and maybe take up in the future. And impact of shape, I already discussed that, and eye tracking, because right now we just rely on the responses given by the people, so by their translucency assessments, whether it's like 1 or 6 or 5, but I think more complex approach is needed. And if we have eye tracking deployed during the experiment, we will see where people are looking and how long and how much they're looking at the caustics. So it might happen that people just look at the object and they say this is translucent without looking at the caustics, or it might be opposite. They might be examining and inspecting the caustics a lot. So that might answer some of our questions, how important the caustics are in general, and also if we interview them, that could provide further insight, because it was the interviewing the people how we came up with this idea at the first place. So they were saying, okay, I see caustics here, this is very bright, this tells me the light is transmitted through the object. So I think more complex and comprehensive approach is needed to identify the role of caustics in the translucency perception. Thank you very much, everyone, for your attention, and now I would be happy to discuss this and to answer your questions. Thank you very much. Maybe I will stop sharing so we can have a gallery view in Zoom and see each other better. Yeah, any questions? Anyone having an idea how these caustic patterns can be removed from the scene in a way that it remains physically correct, but still like does not affect or touch other stuff happening in the scene? Any ideas for improvement or any thoughts?
I'll step in here too and say, if you have a question, please turn your camera on if you can, so that we can see you, and unmute yourself. I'll be watching to see if people who are unmuting, so and I'll watch to see if anybody's asking questions here. And I'll start with a question on the experimental interface. You showed the test image kind of thing on the left, and then you had some references on the right. One way to make the that interface a little cleaner and also get a finer scale of translucency in the process would be to use that reference as in an anchored scaling protocol, where you have one assigned a value of like 20 and the other assigned a value of like 65 or something like that, and then ask people to rate your test image relative to those anchors. So to get an idea of that scale of translucency, and that way you have your references there and people are actually using those to come up with a value for translucency. So then you don't need that pull down menu.
Yeah, in this case, why we couldn't give exact numbers to the references was that we didn't know how people would perceive that. So we didn't have this ground truth. The only, that was also to some extent an assumption, but we showed the extremes from the data set. So here are the smoothest objects and here are the roughest objects. So we assumed they might be also the extremes of the perceptual scale. But theoretically, there might have been some like rougher object that for some reason is considered closer to, closer to transparency. But if we start giving them numbers, then how do we come up with these numbers? Should we base these numbers on physical properties, or because we don't know how people would perceive them, we don't perceptual ground truth.
Right. So that's why you'd use something like 25, 30, something like that. So, and something like 65 or 70. So that if people are thinking on a scale of 1 to 100 kind of thing, that gives them plenty of room on both sides of those references, and that they don't, and in the instructions, you can let them know that those don't have to be the extreme, the references are not extreme values, they're just references, and they can use any numbers that they want relative to those two reference points.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good point.
So, and when I've done studies like that, I'll have people go over, people will give me values over 100. They don't necessarily restrict themselves to the a 0 to 100 scale, but by using something that's well above 0 and something that's well above or below the 100, you give them that room if they have a kind of mindset that they need to use that 0 to 100 kind of scale.
Or another thing, like to avoid these references and the introduction of the scale would be like to simplify the task even further and show the, like, for example, pairs, have a pair comparison and ask which of the two without any category or like any scale to place the object on involved, and then might simplify the task. But in our case, we didn't go for it because it ended up with like very high number of comparisons needed. So we decided category judgment just as a first step.
Yeah. Yeah, generally anything you can do to simplify the task is going to give you a more consistent results. And because, as you noted, observers do try to simplify the task themselves as they go along. So anything you can do to help them in that and make it something that they can easily do is going to help you get the more consistent results. So we have a question in the chat, and if anybody else wants to put a question in the chat, I can read them from there. Dinesh Tiagi asks, does the color of the shape affect translucency perception of that shape?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. There has been works done in terms of gloss, and they showed that darker objects look usually glossier than the lighter one because the highlights stand out more because of higher contrast. I'm not sure about translucency. I don't have a definite answer on this, but I think there might be something about this lightness or luminance information there. If we see that, for example, backlight of the dark objects might lead to higher change in the luminance information of the object than that of like a whiter object. So if we put a lamp behind the white translucent object and behind the black translucent object, this impact of the backlight might be larger on darker object, and that way we might see that, okay, this is more translucent. But in terms of chromaticity, I don't have any like empirical evidence or something, but I don't think that might be that important. In terms of gloss, there is also ongoing debate, but it's still mostly this lighter, darker dichotomy rather than like chromatic information having huge impact on gloss. And I believe something similar will be applicable to translucency. One thing that just came to my mind is it might matter if we have how the color of the object relates to the illumination color. So if we have a red object illuminated with like red backlight and maybe with white backlight, then again, this luminance variation might be impacted in different ways. So it might stand out more that we have some light penetration. But in the end, I think it's more, it's not that dramatic impact as we have like for different shapes or illumination geometries. So it might have like tiny secondary effect on perception of translucency, but it's not as significant as we have like difference between two shapes or difference between two illumination geometries or between static and motion scenarios. But it's a very good question, and I think a good avenue to take.
So you mentioned gloss there, and you had talked in as you were setting up or providing the background for your experiment, you talked about the surface roughness. So that would, of course, be correlate highly with your gloss level, right? So, and you talked about the surface roughness as that just being a surface characteristic rather than a characteristic of the whole body of the
material.
So
exactly. So when we, yeah, that's for sure. When we make surface rougher, that also impacts glossiness, and glossiness itself has been shown to be enhancing perception of translucency or like identification of material to some extent. Yeah, and yeah, there might be some other ways, but yeah, in general, I think why we had this very clear monotonous relationship was because of like possibility to see through. Well, glossiness and highlights, specular highlights are also impacted definitely, but when we have high scattering on the surface, it becomes more and more difficult to see through the object, and object itself becomes blurrier. That's why people associate it with translucency of the material. But yeah, that the subsurface scattering was fixed intentionally because we didn't want for the beginning to have very high degree of freedom. So we said, okay, let's keep my materials identical. The way they transmit light was identical, and we manipulated translucency with surface effects only because we know that we have seen that a lot, that surface also impacts perception of translucency because, yeah, so whether the light is scattered inside the material or on the surface, they still in the end like blur the image behind. So that was the effect we wanted to get without changing the actual material.
okay, interesting. And one last thing, you talked a bit about the what your motivation behind the experiment was, about removing caustics, but I'm not sure that I captured it completely. Is the idea of removing caustics just so that you can do the experiments to understand the impact that they have on our perception?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So how important they really are for the people to judge the translucency of the objects. In some like very particular scenarios, they are very important. For example, I show that dark blue sphere that looked pretty opaque, and then in the scene we saw that there is some light going through. But in most cases, when we interact with the objects, it might or might not be important cue. We might understand that it's translucent without having a look at the caustics. So that's we wanted to see whether if it's there and if it's not, whether that makes any difference.
Okay. So Alan Hodgins asks, how do intelligent cameras such as smartphones perceive caustics? And is there a difference between what the cameras are doing versus what the human visual system does?
Yeah, there are one difference that there might be is the limitation of the dynamic range, because sometimes, for example, in the what glass of water case that I showed on my third slide. Sometimes caustics are very bright and they are very shiny, and there might be problems with dynamic range of the camera, while like our eyes have like broader range, while for camera it might look like very saturated. But other than that, in terms of like intelligence, I didn't exactly get that point, whether
The
they
cameras that do a lot of image processing, I think, is the idea.
whether it is processed to modify the aesthetics of the image, or in what sense do you mean, like they might be using or processing caustics apart from the dynamic range problems that might be caused with very shiny caustics?
Alan, you want to
Sure.
take it from here?
Yeah, I'm just kind of interested. Quite often you'll see something with your eye, you'll take a picture with your smartphone, and when you compare the two, they're different because of the kind of processing that the human visual system does is different to the smartphone. And I'm just wondered, I'm fascinated to try this, but I just wondered if you'd ever explored that.
No, not really. So we took the photographs of the objects for illustration purposes, but we have not observed any like striking difference that could like attract our attention that, okay, look, in the image, this caustic is not that important or does not stand out that much. We have not observed anything like that, but we have not studied this effect empirically. So we have not really gone in depth, but like, I have taken a lot of photos of the objects with caustics, and I haven't really observed something like that really creates striking experience between the two, except for the dynamic range. And when processing, I'm not sure whether there is any caustics aware image processing algorithm which like is particularly aware of this physical effect. I'm not really sure.
Right. Kind of the reason I was asking this question is that I do a lot of work on secure documents, and caustics is starting to become a topic in optical features in secure documents, but so is smartphone capture of the image as well. And I'm just kind of interested to see how well these things will render in a smartphone image as different to a human visual system. I must try it sometime.
Actually, those photos that I showed today are both taken with my smartphone. So they really render the images that even like on the smartphone screen, it's like pretty realistic and impressive experience. So it's not that different from the actual sphere. So my feel would be that it won't have a huge impact, but if we like study this question in depth, there might be some differences.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. One limitation that applies to like the still images in general, like in contrast with motion, like videos or like ability to move in like real 3D, is that, yeah, this motion information, because motion can help us see whether it is the characteristic of the surface of the table, or it is projected by the object. So if we, in our experiment, we allowed people to interact with the object. So in this case, we didn't have any confusion. When they touched the objects, they could move them, and they see then whether this caustic move with the object or whether this texture remains there. So this way they could understand whether it's actual caustics or it's a surface texture table that is kind of tricking them. And yeah, this motion and interactivity helped us a lot. And that is limited in still images. So in this case, making difference between surface texture and the caustics projected by another object, in this case, yeah, there will be big differences, but if we compare just like visual experience based on like two still images, I don't think there is a lot difference.
Brilliant, thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So Davit, was this experiment an online setup or what? Okay, Anku.
Yeah, yeah.
Hi, so I was just wondering if you can talk briefly about how you did this online, basically controlling things that we like different screen size, or was it same or different display types and all that?
Yeah, this was conducted online. We have a platform that is called Quick ML, where we we create the experiments on this platform, and then we send the links to the participants. The only instruction in this case was that people were asked to do this on the like large PC screens, not on the smartphones. But other than that, we did not limit. So of course we do not have like liberation of the display. We do not control the environment, and yeah, we are aware that that might have biased our results to some extent. And if we take this work further, we plan to do the same in the lab in controlled conditions and on like fully calibrated display. But in this case, we just prioritize the number of observers that could participate, and we assumed that this differences due to display settings might be like evened out after like when we have like very larger pool of the participants. So in this case, 50 participants looked like the trends among these 50 participants were very similar, and that gave us a hint that this might be an interesting direction. But yeah, I agree with you that to have like more reliable results, this should be replicated in lab conditions.
I have a question. Hello,
Yep.
everyone.
Hello, go ahead.
Did you try to just work on caustics exclusively? So from your work, I could see that you've taken certain shapes of the objects in 3D and you worked around what they reflect. So, so caustics are basically like bright patterns of light. It's like if you see in water, for example, so in underwater environments, we see caustics all the time, say swimming pools example. So if you take that data and just work through that, okay, how bright they are, and if the translucency or the brightness could improve the perception of humans, would that be something interesting?
I did not exactly get what you mean by working on caustics exclusively. So we considered just processing the images in graphics editor and removing the caustics or modifying their intensity and so on. But then it would not have been physically realistic and accurate. So that doesn't happen in reality, right? If we get, if we try to replicate the physics in physically based rendering and we get the image and then, for example, we crop that caustics in Photoshop, that is not realistic, right? So we didn't go that way. And for under, in water, what has been studied a lot, well, at least I know a couple of papers, it's how caustics impacts perception of realism, like whether you have caustics, you have no caustics, and whether this impacts the how realistic then the scenes look. And for underwater scenes, there are some papers reporting that it was not really significant, but for underwater scenes exclusively, it had huge importance for creating a realistic experience. But for translucency perception, that is my main topic of my PhD, I have not seen any work like on this topic, whether presence of caustics impacts experience or like perception of translucency. And yeah, what if you could like again briefly explain what do you exactly mean by working on caustics exclusively, or because it was perception of translucency, and the caustics are the cues, potential cues that play a role in perception of translucency. And we didn't study like realism or how where can we improve rendering of caustics or this kind of approach. But if you could explain more. Sorry, I'll just make sure that they're right.
So my question was, in your experiments, you have used and prepared the shapes of certain like objects, say sphere and cube, right? And the cast shadows or like the brightest light which were seen as a pattern is what you say is caustics. So my question was, if you just see caustics in real life, in real world, we see caustics all the time. And if you can use that data to run your user study in order to, you know, find if the brightness related to that pattern, which is caustics, could improve how humans, you know, perceive this kind of light. Of course, the question was, it's a very interesting question asked, that what you see in real world is all in 3D. And if you have something and on your smartphone, it's in 2D. So you're already losing a lot of information, right? So that's one thing that we still have to work on. And maybe there is an algorithm, many algorithms on shadow removal techniques. So it's just binary. Everything which is brightest is caustics in your work. So everything which is darkest is the shadow. So you can use that techniques to, I mean, if you work on the pixel level intensities, you can take medians and put filters and subtract it. So that would be one approach, but yours was like pretty straightforward, as you mentioned, not very perfect, that putting black surface and would absorb all the white light. So from colors point of view, color processing point of view, yes, it's very, very simpler and straight. But from algorithmic and computational point of view, yes, there are ways. Like I said, this one of the very, very like widespread and very popular methods is shadow removal.
But our objective was not to, was not like image processing in terms of like just removing caustics per se, because then if we, for example, put a condition in the algorithm, like a threshold that, okay, above this in this region is caustics and below this is shadow, and let's just discard caustics. Yes, we will get some result, but that will not be physically accurate. So that doesn't reflect what happens in reality. Of course, we like the most brute force approach could be just to like erase these areas in Photoshop. But then how interesting it is if people immediately notice that, okay, this is something unrealistic and this looks very weird, wouldn't it impact their judgments? So the why we found this very challenging is that we wanted to change the caustics in a physically correct way. And that's why I mentioned by the end of my presentation that one way to do that is to change the properties of the table or the surface that are projected. So if we make certain table rougher or make it lighter, then the contrast will be less, or if we make it darker, then it might reflect that much, or to some point it might be like the contrast might increase, might be more.
Improve, yeah.
It really depends on these properties. But it's, I think it's not primarily image processing kind of problem, because indeed we can remove them in many different ways, but how to make sure that this remains true to the reality, to the laws of physics, that's that was my challenge and problem in this case. And I completely agree with you that we don't experience caustics in 2D like in most of the time. When we take a wine glass, for example, we all like do all this interaction in 3D. So one way of doing that is to include a video or like have some AR or VR setup. But yeah, we had to start from somewhere, and we decided to start like from the 2D renderings and to see whether these images make difference. But yeah, I absolutely agree that like 3D experience that is closer to our real life might render like different stimuli and lead to different kind of results.
Yeah, interesting. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
I think we have one other question here. Patrick, I don't know if you want to come on and ask.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm a little bit worried. What are your expectations from scattering materials? Because if I take something like this here, a plastic bottle, you will have a hard time identifying caustics with it. Caustics cause that because of the volume scattering. Isn't caustics something that you can observe only in highly transparent material, so that at least you have the phase that is not modified, and so that you have the additive effect of the waves?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I have not investigated that, but I believe, yes, when we have like scattering and absorption happening inside the material, then the caustics will not be that strong. There will be still like some, for example, on that example of the images I showed, there was like some scattering happening inside the material, but we still had this caustic. But of course, when we have like highly transparent media, then and when they refract light, this is sharper and this is brighter. And if we have too much scattering and too much absorption, then we might lose this caustic effect completely, or like to degrade it to very like negligible level. But exactly how this will work, how, for example, scattering phase function or scattering and absorption coefficients can impact that, it's difficult to really like foresee, or whether the caustics generated by those will be like used in a different way by the observers. But yeah, one thing that is like very obvious to me is that if we take wavelengths dependent scattering inside the volume, then object can give its color to the caustic, and that alone is already very important information for the observers. For example, we saw that like orange objects cast like this orange like caustics, and bluish ones cast blue caustics, and this was not due to the surface reflection. This was because the light going through, like because there was like scattering inside, and the object that has this bluish color focused this bluish light onto the surface. So in terms of chromaticity, that will have like very big impact, but how exactly the absorption and scattering will change our like the resulting caustics, that I think it's further study. Well, higher absorption definitely will make caustic like dimmer, and if we increase scattering a lot, we might not get this focused ray bundles that make the caustics noticeable. But I believe that to some extent we will still experience caustics, like maybe very weak ones just close to the surface.
Okay.
Indeed, it also depends on the geometry. So if the path light needs to travel inside the material is large, then that chance of going through it decreases. And if it's like a thin one, then we might get refraction and we might get like stronger caustics, even though if the material is identical.
I think we'll have to leave it at that. So I think we want to thank our speaker, Davit, for a great hour and more of discussion of your work. It's a great opportunity to hear a little more about what you're up to and hear about what you're planning. So this recording will be available if you want to review any parts of it again. And let's all just say thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for attending, for your attention. Thank you very much.